So the second Oppenheimer trailer is out, and me and Wyatt did a reaction for the trailer. If you want to watch it, you can just click here. But right now, I'm going to react to the cinematography and give a little bit of an analysis, some of the creative thoughts that I noticed from the second trailer for this upcoming film. So let's go ahead and start with the very first one here.
We're in a race against the Nazis.
The cool thing about this shot is, artistically and compositionally, it works. It's very Chris Nolan. He does this a lot where, he makes sure the camera's pointing towards the ceiling. So you can have these leading lines, going down hallways, and he kind of centers up his action or his star. So there's a lot of leading lines pointing towards the direction. In this case, that is the case. However, this shot is black and white. And the unique thing about this, if you follow our podcast, Wiseworks podcast, you may have already heard this, but the really interesting thing about this movie is this is the very first time that IMAX cameras shooting on actual IMAX film, so 70 millimeter IMAX film, has been shot in black and white, has been created for the black and white format. You might ask, well, it doesn't seem like that's very revolutionary, but in fact it is. The size of IMAX film, okay, regular film, we're talking like 35 millimeter is like tiny, right? And IMAX film, like one slide, is bigger than my phone. It's wild. And so that big of a format, this is the first film that's ever been shot and baked in black and white. Now, the whole film's not black and white, but he does purposefully and with intentionality intercut black and white into certain films like he did with Memento. That's something that's really important as far as cinematography goes.
All America's industrial might and scientific innovation connected here.
The other thing is kind of a lighting choice, and this is very simple. There's a lot of natural light in this film. I thought this was really interesting because in this shot, you get a natural light coming from this side of the frame and coming in and hitting Cillian Murphy to illuminate his face. You also see that again with another doorway here. And we know from the back and forth cuts in the trailer that they're coming from big windows in each of these rooms. But this was just thoughtfully set up because as they're walking through the hallway, they're draped in shadow. But as he comes in and he references a room, which illuminates his face, and then he looks away and steps into shadow again. And I just thought that's a brilliant way to utilize lighting to make it look natural, but at the same time to make it almost have a strategy to how the lighting and how the blocking and how the movements of the actors are planned through the execution of this scene.
Let's go recruit some scientists.
The other thing is also about lighting, but it's kind of a lesson on how to make natural light look the best. And the easiest way to do that is to shoot shadow side. And you might not realize it, but this is a wide shot that is in fact shooting shadow side. So they're out in the desert of New Mexico. And if we look at this frame, we can tell where the hot spots are. So the top of the car has a lot of light on it. The front of the car has a lot of light on it. The ground obviously has a lot of light. It's in direct sunlight. You get the top of his hat has some light on it. And you kind of see the top of the door that he's about to get in has a lot of light reflecting off of it. So it kind of looks like the light might be right above him in some ways, and it could be coming down, but it's actually slightly above and off to the side. And it illuminates kind of an outline of what's important in your frame, but it's called shooting shadow side because really the action, the emotion, him getting into the door here is in a shadow area. Himself, the majority of his body is draped in shadow here. And the expression on his face is in the shadow side of the frame. And so if you kind of think about it, the sun is like up here and it's coming down at an angle, but it's creating the shadow, and you're shooting into the shadows. You're not shooting with the shadows. It creates better lighting when you're shooting outside, when you're shooting in direct sunlight. And that's just kind of a lesson that can be learned because we don't think about that when we look at a frame like this, but you have to be intentional with where you're pointing the camera and where the sun is when you're shooting in an environment such as the desert or in New Mexico.
Build a town, build it fast.
This is also a really good shot for depth. And, you know, sometimes when it's a really quick moment, he's like, let's quickly build a town, right? And they're building like this cross. They're putting up the little, you know, church. So you got these two guys. It's kind of the middle of the frame. And you have this top of the roof that has some nice leading lines. And you have the background, distant, you know, hills and mountain area, and just the ground in the desert. But the cool thing is, in order to motivate kind of this construction idea, not only are they putting the cross in, but you can see they've run power out there, and they're also using it to create a foreground. So although they have, you know, two layers, you got them, the roof, and then the background, you also have a third layer, which is close to the camera, of these power lines. And it kind of just cuts right through the middle of the frame. For some people seeing that, they may be like, oh, it's drawing too much attention. It's creating itself too much space in the frame for something that's unimportant. But really what it's doing is you can clearly see the action. You can clearly see the characters putting this cross up, but it's creating that 3 layers of depth. And it's also telling a story itself by there's also electricity run into this town as they are building, not just the buildings, but the infrastructure of electricity and plumbing and all of that.
How about because this is the most important thing to ever happen in the history of the world?
This is a moment in the trailer that I just thought was brilliant. And I think I'm just going to be giving Cillian Murphy as many flowers as possible, because honestly, I don't think I have seen acting quite this interesting before. In one moment, you have Matt Damon sitting here as this character, screaming at the guy that they're both looking at, right? Off camera. So we have one actor who is projecting a very specific emotion, which is extreme anger. You must understand what's going on here. And then right next to him, you have Cillian Murphy, who is presenting the persona and the energy of Robert Oppenheimer. And he is doing something completely different. Instead of freaking out or showing, you know, some kind of impassion to match the level of Matt Damon in this scene, Cillian is kind of sitting here almost in thought and almost in emotion. There's this moment where he's looking at the guy that Matt Damon's yelling at, and then he kind of looks down, like he's almost thinking and doing equations in his head. He's almost exploring. He's almost somewhere else mentally, which is very consistent with who Robert Oppenheimer was. And I think in this moment in the trailer, it shone through the most. And it was just very interesting to me. I thought I'd point that out.
We destroy the world. Chances are near zero.
Next, I just want to show these two scenes because this is a good example of how to set up in a dark environment. Traditionally, you want your subject to be brighter than what's behind them. So, and when you're in a bright environment, you can do that vice versa. You can have the background brighter than the person that is the subject. But since they're in kind of this bunker or this dark room, you have Matt Damon, his shirt, everything kind of pops against this really dark cabinet area. And the only thing that kind of matches are these leading line boards that kind of present the same color tone as, you know, his shirt. So it kind of matches, but it's also kind of cool that the exposure, the lighting for these boards is on this side of the frame, whereas, you know, on the other side of the frame, you have the exposure on Matt Damon's face. So like in the background, dark, bright, and on the foreground, bright, dark. I kind of like that contrast, that back and forth. And then the other shot here, the same situation. You know, Cillian Murphy is more exposed, his shirt and his face, than the background that he's around. There's just a few little leading lines here that kind of point you towards the center where he's sitting. But the other thing I wanted to mention is the color difference. So they gave a warm kind of like old tungsten light bulb glow on their faces, but there's like a pop of this teal color over here, and I just think it matches well, like a color difference off camera to the color that is being placed temperature wise on his face. I love color difference in frames. You also see a touch of that teal color up here in the corner. So I just like color difference in images. I think it creates dynamic depth, and it also is just more interesting and balanced aesthetic.
That's happening, isn't it?
The final shot I wanted to explore here is very simple, but if you pay attention, almost everything has intentionality behind it. And this shot definitely does, because, you know, when you're shooting people putting up laundry, typically, and, you know, usually they're going to turn around and see someone has approached them and they're coming to talk to them, you know, or something is stalking them, like in The Conjuring, right? But how you frame it, typically you might have them putting up laundry and they're kind of positioned here, and, you know, they're standing here and they turn around and they're looking here, and their background tends to be this little white sheet or clothes that they're hanging up. Well, in this case, they decided to have, you know, sheet, 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 and they placed her right where there's depth. So it creates this frame between the lines and the sheets. She has this depth of environment and the mountains behind her. And it's just interesting where you place it. She's also sitting on the golden ratio, which is a little bit smaller than the typical rule of thirds. So it's just more centered up. And there's just a lot of depth here, because it doesn't stop with a sheet being behind her head. It keeps going far past the clothesline, and you can see the environment. And I just think, as far as blocking, as far as creating a frame within a frame almost, this is an interesting way to do it. And it's nothing fancy. All it is choosing to say, hey, Emily, when you turn around, make sure your feet land here. And the camera guy, let's just move the camera over just a foot or two to make sure that we get this kind of framing, to make sure that she lands to where her background directly behind her is not just a sheet, but rather the sheets are creating this frame around her. And I think it's beautiful. I think it's very well done, and it's intentional and it's thoughtful. And you too can learn to be thoughtful and intentional with your footage as well. If you can look at stuff like this, learn from it, take notes mentally, enjoy it, and implement it yourself. That's what I aim to do, and that's what I think everyone can do who loves cinematography and loves camera work. So with that, I would encourage you, if you wouldn't mind, subscribing to the channel, liking this video, comment, let me know what you thought of the trailer, the cinematography, any cool facts that you want to share with me. I would love to interact with you about that in the comments. Really appreciate you watching up to this point, and we'll see you in the next video.